This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, the world leader in unmanned aircraft, proudly enabling global defense forces around the world with persistent, versatile, and actionable intelligence 24/7.
This week, my co-host Andy McCreadis and I are talking about what it is like to be a daily intelligence briefer to a senior policy official, a so-called PDB briefer. That is, the President's Daily Brief. Both Andy and I were PDB briefers to President George W. Bush. We'll be right back with that discussion after a quick break. I'm Michael Morell, and this is Intelligence Matters.
Gather life-saving intelligence while keeping warfighters out of harm's way. General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, maker of the Predator and Reaper, is the leading designer and manufacturer of cutting-edge unmanned aerial systems and mission solutions. At any hour of any day, their innovative multi-mission aircraft are ready to deliver unmatched, actionable intelligence over the world's harshest terrains. Industry-leading endurance, modular designs, and advanced autonomy make General Atomics Aeronautical Systems unmanned aircraft the perfect partner for every role in every domain. Learn more at generalatomics.com.
Andy, how you doing?
Good, Michael. How are you?
Good.
Glad to see you back from vacation.
It's good to be back. Well, maybe not. Maybe not, but I'm back. One of the pieces of feedback that you'll remember, Andy, that we got when we asked our listeners what they wanted to hear about was what it was like to be a PDB briefer. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And both of us were PDB briefers. Both of us to a president. Both of us to President Bush.
When I was thinking about that the other day, it was. I can't believe it was over 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago.
It was 23 years ago for me.
Yeah, it's sort of.
Well, that says something about us, actually.
Yeah, no, it does.
So, if you're a listener, we may be a little out of date here. We don't really know, but I think it's going to be good to talk about this and fun to talk about it. And Andy, maybe the place to start is, how did you learn that the powers that be at the CIA wanted you to be the PDB briefer?
Yeah, so it's probably different now, the way they do things, but I had no idea. And I was working for, as you know, Michael, I was executive assistant to Deputy Director John McLaughlin. And I had applied for a job and gotten a job that's, say outside the Washington area. And it was sad. Everyone, family was excited about going. And then the director of intelligence, now director of analysis, but he sent a note saying he needed to see me. And, I got to tell you, Michael, I had a really bad feeling.
Yeah. Who was that? It
was Winston.
Yeah, Winston, yeah.
Yeah, it was Winston Wiley. And that office isn't very far from where the deputy director's office is. And I successfully dodged him for like 2 days because I had this feeling that he was going to sort of yank the other job away from me. And so I finally went to see him, and he said, "You've been avoiding me." And I said, "Well, yes, I have." And he said, I know you have this other job, but I want to talk to you about yet a different job. And I thought, oh God, this is one of those jobs that nobody wants. There's some issue, they're just looking for someone to fill it, and they'll tell me I can take this job, 2 years from now or whatever. And I was preparing my defense, to say no.
Yeah.
And so I patiently listened, and I was ready to sort of throw out the no, I'm not going to do that answer. And then he said, would you consider replacing Michael as President Bush's briefer? And it was like, what did he just say? You're sort of dead in your tracks for a moment.
Yeah.
And, needless to say, I told him I needed to think about it overnight, of course. But I took the job because it was just a opportunity that.
How do you say no, right? How do you say no to that?
And when would it come? Would it come around again? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Same exact thing with me. I was running the office of East Asian and Latin American analysis, and Winston called me up and, said the same thing to me. And even without talking to my wife, which I think was a mistake, I said yes. By the way, Winston, I think is an underappreciated former director of intelligence.
I agree.
I think he did an extremely good job, and he's a man of deep wisdom, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. So Winston, if you're listening, thank you. But after I said yes to Winston, I went across the hall and sat down with Jamie Missick, who was then Winston's deputy, and she said, "I just want to tell you what you're getting into," which is he asks a lot of questions, and he fires at them. He fires those questions at you, like a fighter pilot would, and he expects answers. So all of a sudden, I was questioning my yes to Winston. So what was your first day like? And not your day with me. We can talk about that later. But your first day by yourself.
So just one thing before the first day.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm not sure if it was Winston. It could have been Winston or Jamie. I think it was before you took the job. But I remember one day, I think they were briefing him as president-elect. And I'm one of the two of them came back and said that the president-elect said he couldn't wait to get the good stuff.
Yeah, no, he said that when I was in the room with Winston. Winston was briefing. Winston was turning over the briefing to me, and we were talking about what the president expected of the PDB. And as part of that, he said, and I expect when I become president, I'll start seeing the good stuff. And we immediately went back to the FBI office in Austin where we were prepping. And we called George Tenet and said, we just had a no shit moment. So your first day, what was that like?
So, when you're doing it on, by yourself for the first time, it is so, I don't think I slept the night before, maybe an hour, maybe a couple hours. And, you get in super early as it is, and we talk about that in a minute. But, I spent a solid 8 hours prepping.
Yeah.
And, even when we got to the session in the Oval, I felt I had butterflies in my stomach.
Yeah.
And I certainly fumbled around. And I remember leaving, and George Tenet stayed behind. And I'm thinking,
are they talking about me?
Yeah, they must be talking about me. And I remember thinking in the car on the way back to headquarters, well, today was probably my first and last day in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Because
we were senior officers when we had this job, and I think it's good for people to know that we were nervous, right?
No.
We were nervous, and that's totally natural, right? And I had the benefit of not being in the Oval. I had the benefit of being at the governor's mansion in Austin when I met him. And I was still nervous. So it's a very, very natural thing. The thing that I remember, go ahead.
One of the real awkward things on that first day in Washington was the president introducing me to the vice president. Yeah. He says, Andrew, I'd like you to meet Dick Cheney. And Andrew, this is Condi Rice. I certainly know who these people are. Yeah. So it was sort of a surreal moment. Yeah.
I remember when I first showed up at that FBI office in Austin when I was on my own and I was going to brief that day. And I look at all this material that's sitting in front of me. And I remember saying to myself, how are you going to get through all of this? How are you going to figure out what to say? Right. And you figure all that out eventually. But that first day was not not only overwhelming when I met him and briefed him myself, but when I was trying to prepare, I was overwhelmed.
Yeah. There's so much material. And, there's help in the morning with the assistants and to help you sort some of it. But it can be over. And then you've got to figure out, you've got 45 minutes or so with him. And then there's about a 15-minute thing with the FBI when, we were briefers.
Right.
And so you got to try to figure out, okay, and, as this was every day, about 6 days a week, mostly.
Yeah.
And, 45 minutes of his schedule is a lot of any president's schedule. Yeah. And so you're thinking, okay, this has got to be worthwhile. I've got to be, showing them and talking to them about things that they're interested in or things that they haven't thought about or, peer around the corner for them. So it's pretty daunting. I have to tell you, I sometimes would think about it while I've never been on a high wire. I think about it as you're on a high wire, you don't want to look down because when you look down, you realize you're sitting in this room with the most powerful people in the world sitting there staring at you, all right, for you to say something insightful.
Yeah. And being watched by the vice president, the national security advisor, and the White House chief of staff, and your boss, the director of CIA. Which was
the most nerve-wracking part of all, having George Tenet sitting right next to you. Yeah,
exactly. So what does a briefer do, Andy? And what was it like for you in terms of actually going in there and briefing him? What was it like? How did it proceed day to day? And see if it's any different from me.
So I would get into work around 1 a.m. 1:30. And as you know, the briefing was at 8 o'clock sharp, come hell or high water.
Yep.
And so that seems like a lot of time until you sort of get there at 1 or 1:30 and you realize like there's all this material that you have to make sense of. And at first, I got to be honest, because I had not yet made the connection with the people in the Oval Office, you're sort of just sorting and just, okay, this seems more important than that. And even when you do that, you still have too many things to cover. At least I did in 45 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to boil that down. And that's just the overnight traffic. Of course, there's the pieces that were written by the DI at the time. This is before the creation of the DNI. So the book was CIA.
Yeah.
So you've got those, and then you've got to figure out what he needs to see. And at first, you're going through this like, okay, how do I sort this? But there's a point at which you start to understand them. And that's sort of where it gets better because you start to understand this seems important, but I know they're not focused on this. This can wait.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to, well, oh my God, all this sounds like it's he has to hear it today.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, there were three buckets of what I showed him in a particular day, which were the actual president's daily brief pieces that were produced for him, right? You were sort of obligated to show those, although you could often talk George out of pulling a piece, right? He would readily do that. If there was, if he didn't think it told him anything he didn't already know, right? So there was those pieces, and then there was other analytic pieces that the Directorate of Intelligence, now Directorate of Analysis, produced that, for other customers that you thought the president needed to see. And then there was, the raw intelligence collection, right? The human pieces produced by CIA, the SIGINT pieces produced by NSA, and the imagery produced by NGA. You got to choose what to show him. So there was that stack on my desk. Here's what I'm going to show him today. And then there was a stack. Here's what I might show him, in the future. And I kept a separate pile. So that's how I kind of prepared. What was it like when you went in there? Did he primarily read and then ask questions like he did with me, or did you actually brief him?
So it was a combination of both. Let me just make one comment about holding pieces that were produced by the director.
Don't tell Jamie that.
Oh my gosh!
We had influence with George.
No. So there was a piece one morning that I just couldn't quite get through. I didn't understand it, and I had plenty of material, and so I just held it. And it didn't even get to George. I just held it and just said, "Look, this is not going." And then when I came back,
you did that on your own. You did that on your own.
I did it on my own. And then when I came back to headquarters, Jamie said, I noticed that whatever the piece wasn't in the book. And I said, yeah, it was a little confused. I just couldn't quite get through it. And she said, I was up till 12:30 working on that piece.
Yeah.
So,
I learned that
had to
lesson.
Be careful with that authority.
Get George to pull them next time.
Yeah, that's right. Blame somebody else.
Yeah. So back in the Oval. Yeah.
Back in the Oval. Yeah. So he would let me get a few words in at the beginning. And so I would typically write, I don't know how you do this, Michael, but I would write some notes down along the side of the paper on the margin, like, here's a few key things that I have to get across to the group in there. And then I would get those out. And he was pretty good. He would pause for a second. He wouldn't wait too long. And then he would start reading it.
Yeah.
And then, as you know, as soon as they got, everyone sort of waited for him to finish, and then the questions started, and of course everyone let him go first, but then it could become sort of rapid fire, as you said at the beginning.
Yeah. Two types of questions, right? One, what I would call intelligence questions back to us, the briefers.
Right.
And then the other policy questions, right? To the whole group, not to us, right?
Right.
But to the broader group.
Right.
So two different discussions after you did the briefing.
Yeah. He apparently was paying attention to the fact that I had stuff written in the side of the paper. And he looked at me one day and he goes, "How come I don't get that?" Which is like, George is staring at me like, we don't need to give him that.
Well, remember, I don't know if I read you into this, but I would actually write notes in his copy because I knew that he would have some basic questions, and I didn't want him to interrupt the flow of his reading by asking me the question. So I wrote things in his margin.
So we'd never talked about this, so maybe that's why when he saw it on mine, he said, "Hey, how come I don't get that?
How come I don't get that?"
Oh, okay. It all makes sense 20 years now later.
And because I wrote things in his margin, I also wanted to put it in the margins of the other people in the Oval. So I would have a PSA, a presidential support analyst, right in everybody else's book what I was writing in his book. Well, I had to give them a penmanship test. So I wasn't very popular with the PSAs either.
But just an aside, they were utterly invaluable.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how you could have done that just by yourself without having.
You couldn't.
You just couldn't.
Right. They looked stuff up for you. They did whatever you wanted to do. They gave you their perspective. It was invaluable.
They give you initial triage.
Yeah. And speaking about how long ago this was, I mean, some of the senior officials now at the agency were presidential support analysts when you and I were briefing.
Yes.
It's really nice to see.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Andy, you do the briefing. You get back in the car with either George Tenet or John McLaughlin at the time. You come back to the agency. What happens then?
You have a very short break to get your stuff in order, and then there was the 9 o'clock PDB meeting. And so that's where all the briefers, and just to be clear for everyone, we were the president's briefer, but there was a whole host of briefers briefing, whatever principles the president wanted to get the PDB. So then you'd go to the PDB meeting where everyone would give feedback on how the day went, and what the reactions were to the pieces, where there was interest, where there was disagreement, that kind of thing. I had someone ask me at one point, someone at the agency, how do you know you had a good day? Is it when they liked all the pieces? And I said, well, it's not about liking them. A good day to me, and I don't know, Michael, what you think, was when they had a discussion.
Yeah.
If he flipped past a piece, then it's like, okay, that didn't work for some reason or another.
Right.
But even if he's, had a strong reaction to a piece and it was a discussion, I felt like, okay, we did our job. We surfaced an issue, right?
Right. How did you deal with messages that the president, I guess we're going back to the Oval again here. How did you deal with messages that the president might not actually want to hear because either you're putting a new problem on the table for him or you're telling him that his policy is not working somewhere, even though you're not saying that? The piece is, that's the implication of the piece. How did you deal with that?
So I'd be curious to hear your view on this too, but those, and you sort of knew, before you got there, typically, where the rough spots were going to be. As a matter of fact, and of course, this was a different time. We had pagers, right? There were some cell phones was pagers, and one of the other briefers that would brief Dr. Rice would send me would send me an alert, a 911 alert.
Okay.
That I would then go call him and say, what's up, right? Because she was going to be in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
But when we had those pieces, that's the ones that I really scrutinized beforehand to look for. Is it well supported? Are the arguments, are the facts there? Where are there gaps? What are the things we don't know? Because it's the force of the argument not arguing forcefully. I don't mean that, but it's the force of the argument on paper that you have to. I think that you have to stick to.
Yeah.
Right. And if it's compelling, or if you can get them to see that it was a logical argument and the conclusion follows the set of logic, they may not like it, and there's nothing you can do about that. But at least it's not. If they find holes, at least my experience, anywhere, even a small hole, that there you got the possibility of them sort of saying, "I'm not sure I believe the piece." I don't know how
you give them
how
a reason. You give them a reason to question the analysis.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I tried to diffuse. So on that first day that I met him, when we had this conversation about his expectations of the PDB, when he said, I guess I'll see the good stuff. I actually told him there's going to be days when I tell you something you don't want to hear. And it's either going to be because I'm putting a new problem on the table or because I'm telling you your policy is not working. And then when one of those days would come, I would remind him of that conversation in Austin.
That's great. Yeah.
Right. And I would say, Mr. President, remember I told you this is going to be one of those days. And it helped diffuse it. He would laugh and it would help diffuse it. I was always more worried about the other people in the room than I was him. Yeah, right.
Agree. So there was a stretch where we had reporting on a particular issue that Dr. Rice really disagreed with.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And the president would, sometimes he would get, as you know, the devil on his shoulder, and he would look at her and he'd say, "Condi, Andrew disagrees with you." It's like, oh, whoa.
Andrew.
Yeah. Well, wait a second.
Yeah.
And so that's where the organization stands behind you, right? That this is their work. They vetted it as best that they can. Doesn't mean there can't be mistakes, as we know, but it's not you, right? You're reporting what the organization thinks or believes.
There's also this delicate balance between defending the piece, but if somebody points out a deficiency that is actually there, you can't be seen as defending something that is not defensible.
Right.
So you got to figure out what that balance is, right? You actually come across ultimately more credible if you recognize faults, right, with pieces. So there's this delicate balance.
I agree 100%. I think it's, if someone sort of points out something that is a flaw that maybe you hadn't seen or actually exists in the piece, you have to know how to handle that. On the other hand, you can't just, if you get some pressure, you can't just back off.
Right. You can't crack.
Because then they begin to say, okay, well, this isn't working because you fold very quickly.
Yeah.
So you're right. It balance is a great way to put it. You have to, where is that point?
It's also, it's very similar with the questions he asks, right? Because his expectation is that you can answer a good number of them, but he doesn't want you to make stuff up, right? He wants you to say, "I don't know," when you don't know. I'll get you the answer tomorrow, right? So there's also this way you have to handle his questions. You can't go dumb from the beginning, right? His expectation is, what's he doing here if he can't answer questions? And so there's an important way you handle those as well.
As you know, there's I would be prepared to answer like a first or second level question, because that, and we would have, for the audience, not only did we get the finished intel pieces, but then we had something that was called background notes, which gave you some details about how the analysis was worked up, and so you have some of that, plus other facts that might be of interest. So I try to make sure I knew all those. But you're right. I don't think there was a single time when I had to say, "Let me get back to you on that." That I got any pushback of any kind.
Yeah.
It was like, okay.
Yeah. These background notes we're talking about were really important pieces of paper because they were the analyst saying, "Here's everything else you need to know," as a briefer. Here's everything else you need to know, and they were often. There were often very important points in there, right, that you would want to raise. And sometimes I occasionally showed a background, a portion of a background note to the president.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, analysts, I think, in the background notes felt sort of unencumbered.
Yeah.
And so you could really get a contextual feel for things reading the background note that sometimes might not have come across in a more formal piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of a discussion about being President Bush's daily intelligence briefer.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Back to the agency again after we came back. So we gave feedback to this group of senior folks on the analytics side of the agency. How candid were you?
Okay, I don't know about you, but it depends.
I didn't
answer.
tell you we were going to talk about this.
No. So if there were some particularly sensitive, or it was a particularly rocky session for some reason, so by this time, Jamie Missick was the DDI, and of course I would see her first, just in her office, and I would tell her and say, "Here's what happened," right?
Yep.
And we'd sort of step through what occurred, and then I would give a version of that to the bigger group. So they could get the sense that maybe something didn't work like it should.
Yeah.
But I was cautious because it's those few people in that room, and you don't want that sort of spread everywhere.
Right.
So there were things I would just only tell her, and then occasionally, and you probably had this experience too, something didn't go particularly well, and George Tenet would look at you and say, "You go tell Jamie Missick," right? It's like, well,
yeah, right.
She works for you, not me.
Exactly. I did the same thing with Jamie. Even when she was deputy, I would give her the feedback, and then I would take my guidance from her, right, as to how candid to be with the office directors. I was much more careful on their policy discussion than I was on the way they reacted to pieces, right. Because there's greater risk, right, of that policy discussion leaking somehow than, quite frankly, whether he liked or didn't like a piece.
Right.
So I was very careful with the policy discussion, but I ultimately left that up to her as well.
Yeah, same.
And then you would have a conversation. Once you gave the feedback, you'd have a conversation about the pieces for the next day.
Right.
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 How did that go? How did that work?
And that's interesting because so this is the real value, I think, in having a sort of a line officer as the briefer, because you can come back and do all these things. I mean, if it's just the director in the room or just the DNI in the room, she may have time to do that, but you know how the day goes. They typically don't. Right. But being able to have that time to sort of say, well, I know you want to write this piece on Brazil, but there's some other issues here that probably might supersede.
Here's where you're going in that. Here's where you say you're going in the article on Brazil.
Yeah.
Here's what his questions are.
Yes.
Right? Here's what his questions will be.
Right.
Because we had that conversation last week, so it's incredibly valuable. Yeah,
it's incredibly valuable, and I think you can take pieces that are in the ballpark and get them much more precise.
Yeah.
Right. Now, one thing that I really admired about Jamie Missick, well, a lot of things I admired about Jamie, but one of the things that she was particularly good at, she would often pick something to be a piece that I'd be like, why are we doing that?
Yeah.
And it would be a home run every time.
Yeah.
So she had
absolutely right.
A good sense.
Yeah. And at the time, I thought she was trying to highlight the work of the directorate, right? And I was wrong, right? She was actually had her finger on the president's pulse. Maybe because she attended deputies meetings, maybe she just got a good understanding of him or just good understanding of the issues. But she was almost always right with those pieces.
So following that, let me ask you a question. I typically talk to the authors. I'm sure you did too.
Yeah.
And that could be a great conversation, or it could be if it didn't work for some reason or another. Again, not to like or dislike, but I found that to be super valuable. And even, the hey, this piece didn't work, and let's have a talk about why it may not have worked.
Yeah.
I found a very, no one likes to hear that, but I found a very receptive audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And likewise, after this meeting back at the agency where you give feedback and talk about the next day's book, you would often meet with authors who had a piece the next day or a piece coming in the next few days, right? And they would want to get your take on what do you think he's interested in? Where do you think his mind is? Where's the policy arc, in your view? So those conversations were incredibly valuable too.
Yeah. For our listeners that if you were an author of a piece that was going to run, let's say tomorrow, even though Michael and I would get in at, I didn't ask you what time you got in. Did you get in at same time?
Before 9/11, I got up at 3 to get in at 4. After 9/11, I got up at 11:30 to get in at 12:30. What time did you get in?
Yeah, 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
Because there's so much to go through. I couldn't. But the authors typically also come in very early that morning in many cases. So they would sort of show up at,
we called them pre-briefs.
3 or 4 in the morning. To do pre-briefs to see if you had any questions, see what they could answer, which again was, invaluable because you became smart about a lot of stuff, pretty quickly.
Yeah. That was one of the nice things about the job, was being up, right, on all of these issues and being able to talk about all of these really interesting and important issues. That was fun. So we talked a little bit, Andy, about why these briefings are important to the intelligence community's ability to deliver, a higher quality product. Why is this important to the president, do you think? It's kind of obvious, but not obvious at the same time.
Yeah. Look, the intelligence is sort of this very thin, layer of special material that I think maybe it's better to describe it as a lens that helps you make sense of sometimes a cloudy picture. And so, a president who's getting these briefings, whether they agree or not, realizes that there are multiple views on, maybe he disagrees or she disagrees with what you have. But I think in most cases, they will at least appreciate the argument and look at it from a perspective of, okay, there's more than one way to consider this.
Yeah.
And now there are some issues where there is no, let's call it open source because of, what the issue is. And the only information on that particular issue, even today, I think, is through clandestine means.
For sure.
Right?
For sure.
But today there's so much available more broadly, but I think the what we would do in the Oval Office gives the president that little bit of a leg up. Oftentimes he would read something and he would say to me, well, I just talked to this person and that's not what he said. And so you're like, okay, well,
right.
Maybe he was telling you what you want to hear. So it gives him almost a sixth sense about things.
Yeah. It's it helps frame their view of the world.
Yeah.
It helps frame the context in which they make policy decisions. So it's hugely impactful, and which creates this sense of responsibility, right, on the part of the organization, the IC, CIA, and on you as a briefer, right, not to screw up.
Yep.
I was his daily intelligence briefer the first year of his presidency, and I was the head of analysis at CIA the last year of his presidency. And I saw two different benefits to him in that first year and that last year. In the first year, he did not know a lot about foreign policy. He would be the first person to tell you that. And so we were actually educating him. And sometimes a portion of that book in that first year was educating him on a particular issue. I remember a piece on Al-Qaeda training camps, and it was really, here's how they work, right? Here's how many there are. It was kind of a primer on Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. The last year, so we were really teaching him. That last year, I think he would tell you that he saw the briefings as testing what he already knew and as testing what other people were telling him, including the foreign leaders he would talk to. So he saw it as an important input, not the only one, right, but as an important input in how to think about everything else he was hearing. So I think two different values to him at two different times during his presidency, I think.
Well, and as you just sort of said, it's much harder to put stuff in front of a president that's been in office for 7 years, 6 years, going on, 8, than it is, year one.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're going through a lot of new stuff.
Right. And they've developed relationships with other leaders, right?
Sure. And they have their views, yeah.
They have their own sources of information, for sure. Toughest day, Andy. We're going to finish here with the toughest day and your fondest memory. Okay. Toughest day.
While it wasn't a single day, the toughest, maybe it was a few weeks, was the no WMD in Iraq discussion.
So this is after we came to the conclusion that there was none.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was, you felt like the organization had let him down.
Yeah.
Right. And as the Senate report points out, there's errors that were made and, things that happened that shouldn't have happened for a variety of reasons. But you really felt like, okay, we let him down.
One of the consequences of the fact that he listened to us very closely is that when we make a mistake, it really matters.
Right. So that was a difficult period. I never looked at, he never took it up on any of us or personally.
Yeah.
Right. Which, it's like your parents saying they're disappointed in you. You're like, okay, that's worse than, just yell at me.
Yeah, exactly. And he had that way of motivating people too, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was a rough time.
Yeah. My toughest day was 9/11, for obvious reasons, both intellectually and emotionally, for me as well as him, I think. So that was by far the toughest day. My fondest memory was when it was not only him you were briefing, but his dad.
Yeah.
There's probably, 5, 6, 7 times during my year where Bush 41 would join us. And there'd be 2 presidents sitting there, and 2 presidents who understood intelligence and were interested in intelligence and asked questions. And his dad is obviously a very special person. Those are my fondest memories.
Yeah. So, I would have said that one too. I think the other one it was the last holiday party that we attended. He got all of us together and we had that picture taken. And he was so nice about, I think he said, this is like taking a graduate class in foreign affairs.
Yeah.
Or something like that. And he was very complimentary about us and the work that the organization did and put in front of him. So that it was just, it just reinforced how important this was to him. Yeah. Certainly he didn't have to say any of that. Right. Yeah. But he did.
I remember the first holiday party I went to, we could not find my oldest son's sport jacket. So he went only in a shirt, no sport jacket, and he was the only child there who wasn't in a jacket. I felt terrible, right? Because the president was, the president would never go into the Oval or didn't want anybody else going into the Oval without a jacket, right? And here's my kid running around the White House without a jacket.
So, Michael, at one of the holiday parties, my mom was here, so I brought my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And, you go up and you shake hands with the president and the first lady, and you have just a very short period of time because then they move you along.
Yeah.
My mom would not be budged as she talked to the first lady. And, they were trying to pull her away. And she said to the young woman, she said, just give me a minute. And she kept talking to the first lady. And the president said something to me about the next day. He goes, boy, your mom's chatty, isn't she? And I said, yes.
Well, he was so gracious with his time, right? He would when we walked up the first time, he was, Laura, it's Michael, my briefer, and this is his wife, and this is his children, and he's so
very
gracious.
genuine. Yeah.
Very genuine,
Yeah.
right? And maybe that's where we should end here. Is it's really hard to overstate how comfortable he made us feel, and how much, while there was great seriousness in the issues we were discussing, there was also a levity that he brought to it, right? That he brought to the briefings and the fun we had. And it actually reminded me of working for George Tenet, right?
Yeah.
Same seriousness, same levity. This stuff's so serious, we need to joke about it a little bit. And, he made me feel very welcome wherever we were.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Whether you're in Washington or down at the ranch, or traveling. Maybe that's why the two Georges, George Tenet and George Bush, got along.
Yeah, no, I think so. Both of them have an immense amount of humanity.
Yes. Oh, yeah, 100%.
Right? For sure. Well, Andy, let's leave it there. Great conversation. I hope our listeners enjoy it.
Great reminiscing.
Absolutely. Great to wander down memory lane here. Yeah. Thanks. That was Andy McCreadis and me. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.